If you are interested in quality over quantity and having meaningful conversations instead of just a badge scan, join us April 1st to 3rd at Disney's Contemporary Resort for InfoSec World 2019, where you can connect and network with like-minded individuals in search of actionable information. Use the registration code OS19-SecWeek for 15% off the main conference or World Pass. Also, check out our on-demand material. Some of our previously recorded webcasts are now available on demand at securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right, welcome back, everyone. All right, Paul, so we should probably start with our quick announcement news on Business Security Weekly. We did it on Enterprise Security last week and Pulse Security Weekly. So you want to give everybody a quick update?
Yeah, so you may have seen the announcement. Matt Alderman has accepted the position, is now actively working as the CEO for Security Weekly. I think that the next logical question was what's happening to Paul? I'm still here. I'm the CTO. And it's really that I like to think of it as like a yin and yang kind of thing, right? Matt's going to focus on the security industry and business side, and I'm going to focus on the technology and security community side. That doesn't mean that we don't cross paths or meet somewhere in between, as Matt covers shows and some of the technical stuff, and I cover some of the business and sales call stuff. But I needed more of me, right? Someone to cover and divide and conquer in those two areas as we grow and expand. The number of briefings that we're taking, the number of slots that we have to fill across all of our shows. And the number of sales leads that we are now actually for the first time reaching out, doing outbound like marketing and sales stuff, which has never really happened before. But we've got a lot of slots to fill across a network of shows, so it requires that independent focus. I've got a lot of really cool projects that I'm working on for both our internal technology, in addition to some projects that will be featured on shows and presentations. So it's exciting.
Yeah. It's exciting. And, Michael's still going to be coming on, join us for the show. I mean, he did a fantastic job getting the show off the ground. He's had a lot of items this summer. He missed a number of shows. He was evacuated for one of the hurricanes. So
right.
Michael will be around. But
to an extent, we're victims of our own success, which is a good thing. As Michael said, he's like, dude, I'm just busy, right? And that's good. I mean, that's the goal for all of us that work together, right? Is that we get busy, almost related to our article number one. You get so busy and your roles have to change, and that's really what happened. Of course, Michael's still engaged as a host on Security Weekly and providing valuable feedback, direction, and advice for all of our shows and all of the things that we're doing here at Security Weekly, much like our other hosts do as well. But I think it was important that, as we mature as Security Weekly and we do things like taking on briefings is a big undertaking. And I don't take it, none of us take it lightly, right? Anytime we take our time and the vendor's time to learn what they do, we want to make sure that everyone benefits from that, right? That we benefit, the vendor benefits, and our audience benefits as well. And so that's the goal of that. Plus, it allows us to track the industry more closely, as many of us realize it's really hard to understand who the players are in a particular space and what things everyone does really well and what the differentiators are between them. And so we're hoping to play an even more active role in that on shows like this and other shows on the network. I don't want that to take away from the leadership and communications that we have on this show, which I think is very pertinent to the CISO audience, but also the feedback we've been receiving. And as I look at the data, all the roles in security also listen to this show, which, thank you, that's awesome, because they want to grow and mature in their careers as well. So it's a win all around, and that's why I like I think the focus on leadership and communication is important, especially for any type of role in security. And I also think innovation, that is still going to be a part of this show, certainly. And you may see more of that mix in with Enterprise Security Weekly. I don't think our audience and feedback so far feels strongly like which show. So, we might mix it up for a little while until we find a groove, as there were announcements for some acquisitions and funding, I believe. I don't know acquisition-wise, but I did see some funding announcements, which we'll likely cover on Wednesday on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Yeah, I think, if we can stay focused on some of the leadership communication aspects on this show, leave more of the weekly investment news in Enterprise Security Weekly. We've toyed with, and it's something I want to do more on a quarterly basis, is kind of look at the market from a security funding IPO stock perspective, maybe once a quarter on this show, just as kind of a summary, and leave the weekly news on funding maybe over on Enterprise Security Weekly. Obviously, any of the listeners who have suggestions, I would love to hear them as we kind of think about how best to get the information out on the different shows and making sure we're maximizing that information into the right audiences.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I like your story number one, when getting fired is good for your career. I can't necessarily say that I've been fired all that often, maybe never, but I've left on my own accord probably when I realized that things just weren't working out. I'd also kind of throw that in the same bucket of like getting fired. Like essentially what I thought I was going to do was not what I was being tasked with to do, and there was a mismatch. And I was like, I gotta get out. And that can be really good for your career, but it's a double-edged sword too. Use that time to refocus and shift your career. But I think, that article was really good, Matt.
Yeah, it talks about, 45% have had a major hiccup in their career, being fired, losing a deal, blowing
Mm-hmm.
an acquisition, but yet 78% of them still came into this, came into a CEO role. And I think the most pertinent story to me is when MRK decided to get rid of me and the parts of the security team back in 2003. Brendan, my youngest, I think he was like a week old, and
I
I
was there
lost my
too.
job.
That's really funny you say that, Matt, because my son was maybe a month old when I left that particular job I was talking about, where it just wasn't the right fit. Yeah.
Right. And in this case, my job was eliminated. And,
Yep.
I kind of sat back and I said, well, I could go do this for another company. I ended up going on my own. That's when I got into the GRC space.
I did.
That
Yeah.
was a shift in my career
Yep.
where I went in and ran third-party vendor management for one of the large banks in Cleveland. It gave me the ultimate idea to build Control Path, which was my startup. And so sometimes that's good, right? It
Yeah.
makes you want to refocus and decide where you want to take your
Well,
career.
and in my
And so
case, I got that life-changing phone call from Ron Gula. So, I mean,
right.
not that I recommend that, you take such bold actions all the time, but I really love the quote. Success is about going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And you got to realize that stuff happens for a reason most of the time. And you can make good on that, right? It's a time to reflect and pivot. So,
and it can be very good for your career. It gave me the opportunity to start a company, run a company. Yeah, it didn't end the way I wanted it to, but then I went to Qualys and RSA and Tenable, and now I'm here. All of these events in your career can allow you to change and end up where you want to end up, and so use those to the positive, not to the negative. I think is what I wanted to get out of that story.
Absolutely.
Now, there's a few on goals in this story, and so we can kind of maybe intermix these together. But I thought one of the first one was you don't need a goal, you need a theme, right? And I think what was interesting here is goals exert pressure on you to get them done, but then once they're done, they disappear. Now what, right? And where with a theme, it kind of gives you a direction, so you don't have to worry about solving the goal specifically and then, okay, well, what's my next goal? A theme gives you direction. And so this article talks about not setting necessarily goals, but setting a theme of what you want to do in your career.
I think it's awesome because one of the things that even I struggle with to this day is you confuse a goal with an objective, right? And it's good to have multiple objectives that lead up to a goal. And that more is like a story or a narrative that you're talking about, right? In your when you embark on a journey. And I think oftentimes we confuse objectives with goals. It was actually Josh Wright, early on, and he did the note card exercise, which I really like. And I encourage our audience to do this exercise, and we can probably put some more color around it in upcoming episodes. Basically, you take 5 note cards and you write down 5 goals. right? A goal on each one. Now, the first time you do this, and I suggest doing this as a group, right? The first time you do this, if you have the right leader and coach in this exercise, what you're going to realize is that you've probably written down some either objectives on those cards or goals that need further refinement, right? A goal should be something much higher up in the spectrum of things, right? And then you have objectives to reach them, as Matt was describing. So I thought that was a really great exercise to do.
And the other one here is, I've always heard this saying, a goal without a timeline is just a dream. You have to set a time frame for that as well.
Yeah, I think we did for the cards. I think I set 5 years, because I started to do that with my employees as well. Yeah.
And so that one tied into an article on goals specifically and what's missing. And it talks about two major things. It kind of identified two, not one. One was kind of the process, which you just talked to. But the second one is it talks about you, right? You really kind of stepping back and taking a holistic look at yourself and really figuring out, the you portion of the goal setting. Sometimes we forget about what is it that we want, not necessarily what my boss wants or what the company wants. Kind of step back sometimes and think about goals from your perspective, not an external perspective. And so this article kind of got into some of the nuances of that, talks process a little bit of how to set realistic goals. But I do like that concept of a theme of kind of knowing which direction you're heading.
Absolutely.
All right. The next one was the simple yet powerful weekly planning routine puts you in control. And this talks about just those people that are really good at executing on their schedules. And so it kind of goes through a number of items here on how best to prepare yourself. And the first one, which is interesting because I was kind of doing this yesterday, is plan your week ahead on Sundays. Not what your wife wants to hear on Sundays is that you're working. But my Mondays are crazy now with what we have with the show and prep for the show and some of our calls and
welcome to our world
stuff I have. Exactly. And it just helps me, kind of over the weekend just to kind of go, okay, here's what's coming on Monday. So I'm a little prepared. Number two is understand your tasks and your workflow. So understand, kind of what things you have to get done in what order is part of your flow. We're going through this a lot with HubSpot right now internally. Is you wake up on a Monday morning, you have all these to-dos in your inbox. You're like, holy cow.
Yeah, I assigned a bunch of those to you.
I know you did.
I still have my fair share of to-dos in HubSpot. And we've talked about that. I really like HubSpot. The way that and for me, this was a new kind of way to orient tasks. Now, HubSpot is very sales oriented for those out there that, may not be familiar with it. I, in the past, have used various methods to track that. I think a typical kind of progression, right, is use spreadsheets and email. Then we gravitated to a Google kind of add-on called Insightly to do that. And that quickly, ran out of its usefulness. And then we found HubSpot, and I was like, the thing for me along this topic of doing your weekly planning was constant reminders about a specific task thread. And in the sales process and other processes that we have or you might have, right, there's a certain amount of follow-up, right? Like I need to do one thing today, and then based on either a response or other actions that may or may not occur, in 3 to 5 or some X number of days after that, I need to be reminded to go look at that again and either do the next step in the task or re-follow up. So in HubSpot for sales, it's really obvious how that comes together, right? My initial email to someone may be, I think they'd make a really good sponsor for Security Weekly based on, our criteria, and the technology they have is cool, right? We spend a lot of time figuring out who's got the coolest technology. Okay, let me reach out to that person, and that's my first contact. HubSpot automatically says, create a reminder, or you can automate to say, create a reminder for me X number of days in the future. What's nice about that, Matt, is I can kind of forget about it and move on to the next one. So your brain, and I think a lot of what these articles typically talk about is, that confusion and chaos in your brain. It helped alleviate a lot of that. I didn't have to worry about it, and it took me a while to trust the system that in 3 to 5 days or whatever, I would get a reminder to follow up, so it never falls off the face of the earth, which is what typically happens when I try and track my tasks. So I liked that. However, it's very specific to sales in this case. I'd almost like to find a way to recreate that in some other system, which I'm sure exists. For me, in the way that I work, I really like that way of kind of organizing tasks and planning.
Yeah, that's how you kind of used to use reminders back in the day in Outlook, right? And
Yep.
this creates that reminder system. And that ties in a little bit to number 3, which is protect time for things that will push you forward towards your goals. And it's identifying blocks of time that you just need to focus,
Mm-hmm.
right? And just block that time out. We get so transactional, you and me, especially now, where we've got briefings and we've got prep calls and we've got sales calls. And sometimes you just get inundated with all the activity that you don't block out the time to really think about, okay, what are the other things we have to get done? How do we
How do I
improve
actually
operational efficiency? And
Yeah. How do I get work done? And this was it took my wife a while to realize this as well. And things will get better now that there's two of us that are able to take on a lot of these roles, which was one of the reasons why Matt and I joined forces, right? Is that during the day, like you said, like I may have sales call, briefing call. I do block off my show prep time and then actual show time, right? And then, spending time with employees, making sure they're on their way to doing, their tasks and answering any questions. As many of us, you may realize for Security Weekly that there's people that work and run the business, but they don't have the 15 years of experience in security. Now, they've all come a long way and a huge eye-opening experience on security, but they need to ask us questions as the experts to fill out topics, right? So then my day is filled with that stuff, and it's like 10 o'clock at night, and I'm like, I gotta go back to work. She's like, "What? You worked all day?" I'm like, No, that's a different kind of work, right? And I think these articles are great in having you realize the different types of work to be able to schedule those accordingly. And my advice is to match that with your own kind of appetite for when certain types of work gets done. And I know that certain types of work are better suited to, 10 o'clock at night or after, and other types of work are 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. And then there's a type of work that happens during the day. Balancing all of that, I think, is one of the keys really to success, is knowing yourself and when you work best and applying those different types of work.
yeah, and that all ties into use your calendar as your main productivity tool. I cannot survive without my calendar. Everything's there. I wouldn't know where I'm supposed to go without my calendar.
And I tell you what, over the past couple of years, I started using the automatic calendar system, which I don't know how I ever lived without that, right? We've experimented with Calendly, as well as HubSpot has a system where basically you give people a link and they can schedule some time with you. Now, on the back end, you've got to make sure you've scheduled your different work types so that people aren't scheduling meetings when you're trying to do a certain type of work. But that's been, and Michael was big on this, as he does a lot of advisory work, right? He would have blocks of time where this is where people can schedule this type of meeting with me, and those type of systems are so awesome. And I think that also, as technology people, when we all work together, we're getting more accustomed to getting a meeting link for someone. In the beginning, when I first started using it, people didn't use it as much as they do now, I believe. And I think we're more accustomed. People aren't as put off when I say, yeah, just book some time with me, right?
Agreed. All right. Let's go to, I love this IDC article on CIOs who don't empower IT teams to disrupt, scale, and innovate will fail. And I like this article because this was part of our strategy work back in 2015 around Tenable about not only the future of security, but the future of technology. And in this article, it makes some interesting predictions that I kind of talked about back then, which is the CIO's role is going to shift. And just so you guys all understand, when the CIO's role shifts, the CISO's role will shift with it, right? This is not isolated to the IT industry, and that they have to be more aligned with the business, that their compensation will come through cost cutting, alignment of the business, growth on the business side, right? The CIO is going to be a technology enabler for the business. And that means CISOs who report into CIOs will also have some shift, I think, also in their role on away from some of the operational components, but also figuring out how to deal with risk reduction and other things in those environments. I thought this was a really interesting article because I think we're going to continue to see that shift of both the IT and the security executives being much more aligned and much more compensated based on the success of the business.
Yeah, I think that's interesting as I look at my new role now is I also wear the CIO hat in some respects as well to drive the IT behind the shows, right, which is very technology driven. And I think this article is correct. If you're not looking to, I mean, disrupt is an overused word, but scale and innovate is really where your focus needs to be. And you're right, Matt, security needs to be behind that 110% to make sure that you're allowing scalability and innovation, but also adding in so that you can do it securely and not, again, being that department of no.
Exactly. And Alex talked about this in the last segment a little bit, is that risk management process. Without some risk, you're limiting opportunity and growth. And so you have to understand that balance. And that means from a security perspective, we got to understand where the business wants to go and figure out how to reduce risk in those growth opportunities. Just like the CIOs have to kind of align to bringing in technologies and processes that allow them to continue to scale and innovate.
And I really think that this is off the cuff, but the number of different attacks and number of different assets that you have is so hard to track today. So like, how do I know as we adopt new technology as an organization where all the different gaps might be and how they might be exploited is just, and I think that's what one of the things that's going to solidify the CISO as a role is constantly trying to get a handle on that. And I think about, John Strand has a webcast, and this is actually a topic that I'm going to be working on. How do I understand my external threats and map those and get those down to some type of action that someone can take and on an ongoing basis do that? In other words, as we spin up new websites and domain names and certificates and all of this new technology, how do I have something that's constantly checking that, right? There's a lot of open source tools to do that. There's a lot of vendors that claim to do that as well, to different, in different takes, different points of view on that problem. But I think that's one of the most challenging things today. And I think it kind of likens it back to what Alex said when you ask people what their most challenging thing is and they say cloud. I think that's a piece of it, right? Is because of the way we're implementing technology today. How do we keep tabs on our exposures moving forward? And it's not just about, you and I worked at Tenable, right? It's not just about vulnerability management. That's also a small piece of it as well. It's managing your exposures that I think is probably the number one challenge, right? At a high level.
Yeah, it is. And again, this ties into this whole concept of metrics and mapping and risk management, which now ties me into the next article, which is why aligning IT with business goals is the key mantra, right? If we don't understand what the business is trying to accomplish, then it's really hard to set not only IT goals, but also security goals. I used to do a presentation on metrics when I was at Tenable, actually, and it talked about how do you map your different security metrics to business goals. And I would give some high-level examples. If one of my business goals is to improve customer retention, then things like protecting customer data is important, right? Because if there's a breach and you lose trust with a customer, then I might not retain them as a customer, right? That's a very valid business goal. Well, that means I have to have certain controls in place from a IT and security perspective to protect customer data, because a breach of that data could maybe not allow me to retain them as a customer, right? And so there's aspects of these simple alignment techniques that you can use to say, once I understand the business goals, now I can align a set of security controls and metrics to actually track in the board meetings, actually report on how you're helping achieve those business goals. And I think that's really important.
But that's a great example, because I think what's awesome is it allows IT and security to get ahead of it. If you know that that's a future goal for the company, where IT and security can work together and say, well, in support of customer retention, we need to encrypt customer data. And maybe we have some specific storage solution that allows us to do that. But then you have to think data needs to be shared, right? So then we need to have a solution that allows people to share data more securely, be implementing those projects in support of those specific goals. That could incorporate technology you already have. It probably is going to incorporate some new technology, but getting ahead of it is the key.
Yes, and you start at the business and you work your way down. Those goals are what the business is trying to do to hit their revenue targets, their growth targets, everything. So that's where you should start.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I got a couple more in here, but I wanted to touch on this. Using experiments to launch products, and it talks about a couple use cases with Uber and Airbnb on some different ways to experiment on launching these new products. But they also give you some very interesting tips on how to get ready to do this and then analyze the data, which I thought was interesting, because I think sometimes we do the same things to launch a product, and are those the most effective way to get the word out and to get feedback on new products as they launch into the market? So I was kind of digging into this article a bit on this one.
Yeah, and that can be an interesting one. You know, typically when I talk to others in a similar role in security, right, we're probably not, in many cases, we're not the ones actually coding the entire solution and launching it. Oftentimes we'll prototype it, but how do you get feedback on that prototype and then hand it off to actual software engineers that are going to engineer a product, right? And having that test, as some of the examples in here with Uber, and doing that effectively is certainly something that I need to research more as well.
Yeah, in here it gives you kind of four main things to think about. Decide on which metrics you want to use, and then come up with the hypothesis, right? So think about what you're expecting, then choose a random subset of markets to launch, then make sure you track not only whether the product is working, but how its launch affects existing products. Did you see an uptick in existing products because of the announcement or the launch of that product? And then the final tip here was make sure you understand why your product is succeeding or failing, right? And that will help drive your product roadmap, and then also potentially additional enhancements and things that you want to roll out to the market.
Well, that's why you need Danalytics. That's our internal term for Dan Wheatley from Straight Talk, who's been working with us over the course of this year. He was actually featured on a Business Security Weekly episode, maybe when it was Startup Security Weekly last year. In any case, we hired Dan, and one of Dan's roles primarily is helping us collect and analyze the metrics for a lot of different things that we do. And doing so well that he earned the nickname Danalytics, and is actually working with some companies in security now as well as a result. But it really, this year made me think about metrics. And I think a lot of people just want to collect data, and that's one step, but analyzing it and making the right decisions off of it is a whole art in and of itself, an art and a science, right? Episode 79 is where Dan was featured. Yes.
Yep. And you apply it to everything: products, launches, solutions, our own shows.
Internal metrics that we were referencing in the interview with Alex, right? I mean, there's a whole metrics conference, and what are the right metrics? It's why I asked Alex, like, what metrics work to measure your programs. And I think that's going to be a continuing trend we're going to talk about for a while, as I see more categories emerging that are really looking to provide us with metrics. Now, they provide us with some really cool security stuff too, but you got to be able to take those metrics from it, right, and apply those correctly. I think attack simulation and third-party risk management, right? I mean, they're all about really metrics about your security program or someone else's security program.
Yep, exactly right. We'll do more on metrics later. We should do a whole segment on metrics at some point. I have to dust off that old presentation and pull out some examples.
Right, because I think it's changed. I mean, we used to talk about very basic metrics, And I think a lot of those are still applicable, but tides have shifted in so many technology fronts that you might have some different metrics. And metrics about where you don't have visibility are just equally as important as the ones that you may have visibility on. Like not having metrics is a metric in and of itself.
True. Were there any others you wanted to cover? Or those were the main ones for me for today.
Yeah, no, I liked those. I think losing sales opportunities is an interesting one. Sales
It is.
as a whole.
Yeah, that's the one that's on my screen right now. Is it sales execution or is it product insufficiency, which is always an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think that that also relates to internal projects as well. And certainly I've been part of very successful projects and projects that were just huge failures. And I think that the metrics you need behind them is to understand why. And I think that's what this article is getting at, right? Was it the execution? In the case of internal, it's slightly different, right? And speaking of a particular experience I had where I tried to bring a technology in-house and it just wasn't the right fit. Now, was it that we had different problems and challenges that the vendor wasn't able to overcome? Or was it a good match on the surface, but the vendor really didn't provide great solutions in those areas? Or were there other deficiencies internally that we had to address before we should even think about adopting, that technology? In other words, we weren't ready for that technology. And I think those are all interesting things to consider, hopefully find before you try and, evaluate and implement a particular project. But I think those mismatches often lead to, and I know a lot of people are sitting out there and they know exactly which product and project this is in your organization. We bought something, we implemented it, and now it kind of just sits on the shelf and someone checks in on it once a month and it's not providing a lot of value. How do we avoid that? Of course, that's applicable to an external sales process, but think about how you adopt technology to solve security problems.
Yeah, the one I wanted to add to this article was, sales execution, product insufficiency, or marketing, right? Because marketing's the other piece in this equation. Because if you're marketing the wrong things to the wrong people, it could limit sales. It could be because the product's insufficient and you're trying to drive opportunities.
Product market fit. I mean, we talk about product market fit all the time in a lot of different scenarios. That's like the number one thing. Yeah, I think when you come to market, you really have to nail that, and it's not easy. Right? I mean, we see it on Shark Tank all the time, where they've come up with something great, and you can have the best technology and product in the world, but you're not making that right fit to the right audience in the right way.
Right. And that can really impact sales opportunities if you're trying to market the wrong product to the wrong audience.
Yep. Yeah, it can make your sales process really long. And it shouldn't be that long, right? If you've got the right fit, it should be a much shorter sales cycle. And that relates internally as well. If you're trying to push this particular technology and project to solve a problem and it's taking forever, you might need to take a step back and be like, maybe I just don't have the right fit. Awesome.
That is true.
Very cool.
All right. With that, I think we're a wrap.
Oh,
thank you.
One thing. Sorry. Before we end, we're going to talk about this on Enterprise Security Weekly, but I wanted to mention it quick. It is now public because it's on Javelin Network's website. Javelin has been acquired by Symantec, and that did become public today. It's interesting how it hasn't hit some of my other feeds where I get notified about stuff like that. But I did check the Javelin website, and it is there. Congratulations to all of our friends at Javelin. In fact, Eyal Nemani will be on Paul Security Weekly doing a technical segment this week on Thursday. Really, really cool stuff. Obviously, from Javelin, there's a fantastic team there. And they've been acquired by Symantec, which is great. This is awesome. We were talking about teasing two of our sponsors. We're having successful exits. The timing was just a little off on the announcements. Of course, Matt was working at Layered Insight. They were acquired by Qualys, and now Javelin has been acquired by Symantec, which is awesome for me. It's just personally gratifying that we've worked with these companies and helped them go to successful exit, and that we work with technology vendors that can have successful exits in our larger companies are interested in acquiring them. It solidifies that our process for selecting sponsor has some merit to it, obviously.
Yeah, 2 sponsors in 2 weeks. That's success.
Right? Yes, absolutely.
All right, now we're going to wrap up.
Now we're going to wrap up. Sorry.
Now we'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.